And when he emerged from the boat, he was fine and could speak. But now he has been treated in the hospital, and it appears that his throat or vocal cords have been cut. More evidence of him clamoring. That blood is not real blood. In fact, it's already been tested and turns out to be fake. Notice the individual grimacing there, or seeming to, with the stump or a leg. There's a fascinating scenario here, because it turns out we have a whole scenario of an individual in a hood who is helping him to fake his performance. Notice if this were a real stump, a real, spontaneous amputation, his blood would be spurting out of his leg. But that is not the case. Not only is that not the case, but we now have footage where he's being rushed away in a wheelchair, and lo and behold, it appears the artificial prosthesis they had imposed over his own previously amputated leg fell off, and they had to stop and put it back on. Here's the guy who actually lost his legs in Afghanistan. He was a lieutenant with the 1st Stryker Brigade. There's a lot going on here, but very little of it is real. Apart from the fact that we have a remarkable military presence on the streets of Boston, we have Chuck Hagel, our Secretary of Defense, saying that he is prepared to jettison posse comitatus, which was an act of Congress passed in 1878 that precludes the use of the armed forces of the United States to perform police functions, which was, of course, being dramatically violated in this instance, where that may well have been one of the objectives for this event, where now the mayor of New York City, who most recently wanted to deny us the right to buy a big gulp, I mean, how absurd can you get, is telling us that we may have to reconsider the Constitution. The mayor of New York is telling us we may have to reconsider the Constitution. And as though things could not get more absurd, the claim is now being made that the son of Osama bin Laden was in the crowd, that he was injured, that he was taken to a hospital, and there are photographs you can find on the internet where Michelle Obama has apparently come to visit him, where many Americans still to this day believe that the raid on the compound in Pakistan was authentic, when the fact of the matter is that Osama bin Laden died on 15 December 2001 in Afghanistan. He was buried in an unmarked grave in accordance with Islamic practice. There were local obituaries at the time. Even Fox News reported his death in February or March thereafter. There's an excellent article about his life and death by the British historian of science Nicholas Fullerstrom, entitled Osama bin Laden, 1957 to 2001. There's a whole book by David Ray Griffin entitled Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive. This was a fantastic event. As the head of scholars, I had previously published studies showing that all of the Osama tapes since his first interview about 9/11 had been phony or fake, where during that first interview he denied that he had anything to do with 9/11. He observed that the murder of innocent women and children was contrary to the tenets of the Koran, that while he objected to the stationing of American military forces in Saudi Arabia, the home of Mecca and Medina, the two most holy sites in Islam, that there appeared to be a government within the government of the United States that wanted to pin this crime on Muslims, where no less an authority has made the very same observation, to wit that there's a government within the government and that he does not control it, than William Jefferson Clinton. And when this raid took place, a widely disseminated photograph showed the Vice President, the President, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, all intensely watching large screen television that we were given to understand was following the raid as it took place. However, Leon Panetta, then the director of the CIA, contradicted that claim by observing that the first 20 or 25 minutes there was no visual coverage, which means that this photograph, like so much of recent history, was fabricated or fake. Or I think we have to induce Al Franken to revise his cover ever so slightly to represent more accurately the liar-in-chief, and where, remarkably, a woman legislator from New Hampshire has observed that, in her opinion, the Boston Marathon bombing was conducted by the government, where a publication called the J.D. Journal has taken after her with the following observations. Conspiracy theories have a certain attraction. They show the world under an original and peculiar perspective, as if everything you've been told is a lie. Not only paranoid schizophrenics take stock in it, but the genre has a fervent group of fascinated writers willing to stipulate who really killed JFK, who really blew up the World Trade Center, etc. And such speculation, though usually responsible, is at least entertaining. Nevertheless, when legislators start getting behind it and putting their name on such theories, we have serious recourse to question their standing and legitimacy. Republican state legislator in New Hampshire, Representative Stella Tremblay, a Republican from Auburn, for instance, has suggested that the Boston Marathon bombing was done by the federal government. We would expect better from a lawmaker, except, of course, what she's saying appears to be true. And if JFK entails an impossible bullet, an impossible photo, an impossible film, and an impossible shooter, then we have to come to the realization that the government has been lying to us big time about major events. Recall the official declaration was 3 shots fired from the 6th floor window by a lone demented assassin by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. Allegedly, a disgruntled Marine, although they never really could identify what motive might have caused him to perform this action, and where his own wife observed that he admired JFK and bore him no malice. Here's a famous photograph, one of the most, taken by AP photographer James Ike Algens. Circled in the presidential limousine, you can see a through-and-through bullet hole, a small, wide spiral nebula with a dark hole in the center. JFK is clutching his throat. He has just been struck by a bullet that passed through that windshield en route to its target. In area number 2, we find a figure, enigmatic in the doorway, that even Oliver Stone, the director of the famous film JFK, had concluded was a co-worker by the name of Billy Lovelady. In 3 is a window in the Daltex building for a broom closet that actually belongs to a uranium mining company that was a CIA asset, from which 3 bullets appear to have been fired, one of which missed and injured a distant bystander by the name of James Tay, another of which missed and hit a chrome strip above the windshield, the third of which hit JFK in the back of the head after William Greer, the driver, had pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt to make sure that JFK would be killed. Here's a close-up of the windshield on the left, and then on the right in the orange circle, the very different windshield that the Secret Service would later produce, claiming it had been brought about by a fragment of a bullet fired from behind. But we tracked down even the official at Ford Motor Company that was responsible for supervising the replacement of the windshield, who confirmed that it had a through-and-through bullet hole, as many witnesses at Parkland Hospital had observed before the Secret Service, upset that they were paying so much attention, moved the limousine out of public view. And even in a frame of the Zapruder film, 325, you can actually see the bullet hole in the windshield, making it increasingly difficult to deny. In relation to the film, Life magazine did something quite extraordinary by breaking the plate twice to rewrite the caption in order to suggest that this was the frame from which they were able to infer the direction from which the bullet had been fired. A Hollywood expert on cinematography by the name of Roderick Ryan explained to Noel Twyman, the author of the masterpiece Bloody Treason, as long ago as 1996, that the blood spray and the seeming blob of brains that bulges out to the right front had both been painted in. Ryan would receive the Academy Award for his contributions to cinematography in the year 2000. Here's another where you can see a bit of the bulge. If you follow it through a number of frames after 313, the frame in which, as the film depicts it, the accident film depicts it, he is hit. You'll see there's a consistent pattern there, but notice in particular the back of his head is quite black. In fact, a group of Hollywood film restoration experts obtained a forensic copy of the film from the National Archives, which they have been studying intently. And when they blew it up to take a closer look at this area, they couldn't believe the amateurishness of the way in which it had been concealed. They had simply blown up the film and painted it over in black, and then shrunk it back down. Now, it occurred to me that it was entirely possible that in focusing on the frames after 313, they might have overlooked a later frame, and indeed in 374, I found where you can actually see the blow-up to the back of JFK's head, which means that the Zapruder film is not even internally consistent, not to mention that we have as many as 60 witnesses who report that the limousine was brought to a halt in Dealey Plaza. We have a motorcycle officer who, during this interval, rode forward to inform Chief Curry, where his doing so was confirmed by Forrest Sorrells and Winston Lawson, and where 3 other motorcycle officers confirmed it. Indeed, among the witnesses who confirmed the limo stop are all 4 of the motorcycle escort officers. Plus, there is an unaltered version of the film, which at least a half a dozen of persons of my acquaintance have seen, several of whom I have interviewed, who report the limo stop taking place. And this is quite fascinating. Flint Hill, who is the most conspicuous figure in the film by virtue of rushing forward and getting up on the back of a limousine, where he remains in the accident film until it passes under the triple underpass, has reported consistently for nearly 50 years now that he not only got up on the back, but pushed Jackie back down in the seat where she had reached out for a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains that was sitting on the trunk, lay across their bodies, peered down into a fist-sized hole in the back of JFK's head, then turned to his colleagues and gave them a thumbs down, all before the limousine reached the triple underpass, which has even been confirmed by Roy Kellerman, who was the agent in charge sitting in the passenger seat beside William Greer, the driver, who had brought the limousine to a halt, where Kellerman told the Warren Commission that he had looked back at this point in time and seen Flint Hill lying across the trunk. It was actually the back seat. But of course, we see nothing like this in the accident film, because bringing the limousine to a halt was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity in the crime that it had to be taken out. Everyone here, I'm quite sure, is aware of the magic bullet. The original inference of the FBI and the Secret Service was that 3 shots had been fired and all 3 had hit. Namely, that Jack had been hit in the back about 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the shoulder blade. Connolly had been hit in the back, and then JFK had been hit in the back of the head, killing him. But when they discovered that one of those alleged 3 shots had missed and injured the distant bystander, they had to become very creative and decided that instead of having been hit in the back, JFK had been hit at the base of the back of the neck, that the bullet had transited his neck without hitting any bony structures and exited his throat, so that wound to the throat which Malcolm Perry, MD, described 3 times as a wound of entry, which was caused by the bullet that passed through the windshield that we saw him clutching in the Algen's photograph, would thereby be turned into a wound of exit. And the claim could be made that all the wounds in Connolly were not caused by a separate bullet, but by this one. Except that it turns out this magic bullet theory is not only contradicted by all the evidence, the shirt, the jacket, the autopsy diagram, FBI diagram, reenactment photographs, but that David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, who is the leading expert on the medical evidence in the world, took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions, created a CAT scan, and plotted the official trajectory, only to discover that it's not even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. So there's a simple answer to the question of the magic bullet, whether there was such a thing or not, which has been the subject of endless speculation in documentaries, even including Peter Jennings solemnly intoning that they did a reenactment that showed using models that the magic bullet was a possibility, except of course that the models, the animations they used, suffered from the peculiar defect that they had no backbone, no cervical vertebrae, because in fact it's not even possible. So the magic bullet theory is not only false, provably false, it's not even anatomically possible. Jack actually was hit 4 different times. This is notes from the mortician who spent more time with the body than anyone else. He had a large gaping hole in the back of his head, which he believed was patched by filling with plaster of Paris. That he had a smaller wound in the right temple. This was the entry for the wound that blew out the back of his head. At the same time, it opened a crescent-shaped skull flap beside the right ear. That there were approximately 2 small shrapnel wounds in the face, which he discovered when embalming the body and they began to leak. Mantic inferred quite brilliantly, in my opinion, that when the bullet passed through the windshield, small, tiny shards of glass penetrated JFK's face and led to these tiny puncture wounds. Then he had a wound in the back, which you'll recall I mentioned was 5.5 inches below the collar. Here it's described wound in back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the backbone. Most interesting, if you read down, no swelling or discoloration to the face, meaning he died instantly in Dealey Plaza, where I believe that the physicians at Parkin were seeking to respect his religion in order to have a priest administer last rites before he was formally pronounced dead, which took place a half an hour after the shooting at 1 p.m. We've also discovered, based upon research by the Assassination Records Review Board, a 5 civilian-member independent panel that was authorized by Congress in the wake of the resurgence of interest in the case generated by Oliver Stone's film JFK to declassify documents and records held by the FBI, the Secret Service, the CIA, and so forth. And among the very first of their releases, which appeared in time for me to include it in my first collection of essays about the assassination, which is entitled Assassination Science, 1998, which one critic, obviously unfamiliar with the work, thought was a description of how to be scientific in the conduct of assassinations, rather than how to use science to dissect them and sort out the true from the false. That Gerald Ford, then a junior member of the Warren Commission, as a representative from Michigan, had the wound re-described from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of his neck to make the magic bullet theory more plausible. Even more interesting is the evidence we have that Oswald cannot possibly have even been a shooter. One of the more remarkable features of this case is that the arrest report is timed 1:40 and states, this man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy and wounded Governor and police officer J.D. Tippit, that he also shot and killed Governor John Connolly. But the fact of the matter is, Oswald wasn't arrested until 1:50 at the Texas Theater. So you're not only getting ahead of the game by drawing conclusions about a man who purportedly was arrested for walking into a theater without purchasing a ticket, hereby declaring as though it were fact that he had shot and killed the officer and the president while wounding Governor Connolly, but also it's dated prematurely at 1:40. And I must say, it's a really striking curiosity that the younger brother is accused of shooting an MIT security guard, and that is supposed to be a reason for thinking that he was a participant in the Boston bombing. The reports that are coming out now, however, say that they knew each other personally, that he wanted to surrender, so he went to the security guard to give himself up, and when the security guard called in to say that he had him in custody, someone who didn't like the way this was playing out showed up and shot him in the face. Now, when Lee Oswald was photographed, it's most interesting he's in a t-shirt, because that's not what he was wearing when he was arrested, as I am going to explain. And it's also worth noting that he passed his nitrate test, which was positive for nitrates on the hand but not on the cheek. If he fired a rifle or a carbine, then there would have been nitrate residue on his cheek. So the fact that it's on his hand was doubly exculpatory. It showed that he could not have washed the nitrates off of his cheek without also washing them off of his hand. And the fact that he had nitrates on his hand was easily explainable because he worked in a book depository. Books are printed in ink, and ink is loaded with nitrates. Here is Oswald when he was arrested. Pay attention to his shirt, which turns out to be of extraordinary importance. It's a very unusual shirt. It has many distinctive features. Notice at the bottom how it seems to be kind of tattered and torn, how it's splayed open. If you were to look more closely, you'd see he is wearing a t-shirt, but that he had the habit of tugging at his collar and tended to stretch it out. Very much to my astonishment, the Assassination Records Review Board also released the handwritten notes of Will Fritz from his interrogation with Lee Oswald. But you can't read it here. In the typed version, you can see that Lee told him he was out with Bill Shelley in front at the time of the shooting. Now, Bill Shelley was an assistant manager of the book depository. This release was so extraordinary to me that I went back to look again at the Alshan's photograph to see if there were something significant there that I had previously not considered. And indeed, I found on the website of a famous defender of the Warren Commission by the name of John McAdams of Marquette University, a collage that featured a number of claims that have been made by those who are seeking to make the case that Billy Lovelady was indeed the man on the doorway, and shown here on the furthest to the left. But what I noticed, what McAdams hadn't pointed out, that there's a figure whose face has been obfuscated, which I have here circled in orange. Now, at this point in time, I was inclined to believe that the face obfuscated had to have been that of Lee Oswald. There would have been no reason to alter this historic photograph unless someone had been there who should not have been there. Or the only candidate for that role appeared to be the alleged assassin himself. So at that point in time, I inferred that the man with the obfuscated face must have been Lee Oswald. Closer study for this area of the doorway, however, reveals a number of rather fascinating features. Look at the man in the doorway. Observe his left shoulder. It's not there. The man is missing his left shoulder. Moreover, the man immediately behind him, who has a narrow black tie, to whom we have referred as the black tie man, is both in front of him and behind him at the same time, which is clearly impossible. So, I mean, here's the clavicle, the bone that's missing from the man in the doorway. Fairly astonishing. And indeed, after I published that article suggesting the man with the obfuscated face had been Oswald, I was contacted by a fellow of mine